You must know that just before I came up here, I turned to the colonel and said I should just laud the extraordinary commitment of my fellow speakers, endorse everything they've said, and sit down. But I'm not going to do that. First of all, I would like to, not only to my colleagues on this panel, but to so many others who have stood with me and with us in support of you and your family and friends at Camp Ashraf. I want to publicly say how honored I am to be in their company, and that their commitment and their courage and their honor, the integrity they have brought to their public service and to the cause and the support of the men and women at Camp Ashraf and the democratic opposition in Iran is an association with which I have been and will always be most proud. I'm grateful to be in their company. And as importantly for all to hear, I believe that their advocacy, their insight, their passion, and their perspective should be heeded, not questioned. I'm grateful to be in your company. The thought occurred to me how I could distinguish my few remarks from my colleagues, and it's going to be virtually impossible. So let me first just share with you a couple of my own personal experiences, if I might. I think my friend Andy Card talked about there are a lot of great leaders in MEK, men and women alike, but it takes my breath away to listen to the strength and the courage and the commitment in spite of deep pain and great personal loss of women who have lost husbands and sons and daughters who say their lives will not be given up in vain one of these days because of their efforts and the efforts of so many of their fellow citizens. There will be a free, pluralistic, democratic Iran. It's rather remarkable. I almost carried with me here the volume that's been prepared called Fallen for Freedom. And what the MEK and the organizations in support of their cause have done is not only listed the names, but provided pictures of almost 20,000 men, women, and children, some biographical information. And you can't help but look at that volume and say to yourself, who are the leaders? Who are the physicians? Who are the scientists? Who are the lawyers? Who are the politicians? 120,000 futures, which we'll never know, but certainly we're committed to a free, open, pluralistic, democrat Iran. And I said to myself along those lines, thinking about the times that Secretary Clinton, then Senator Clinton, very appropriately invited me to her office in the Senate when I was Secretary of Homeland Security. And when she called me to her office, it was not to do anything except discuss very serious matters in a very substantive way that were on her mind, the mind of her constituents in New York, perhaps even the broader national community. So I went well prepared to be engaged, to have a good conversation, and hopefully to be enlightened and enlightening at the same time. So it occurred to me that if Secretary Clinton or anybody else in the cabinet would pick up the phone and say, you're no longer in public service, but would you mind coming up and talking to us about the MEK and delisting, what exactly would you say? Well, I'd certainly recount the personal experiences I've had. We'd have to go back to, I think it was 1997, when for whatever reason, and others have explained the process of identifying a group or organization and placing it on the list of foreign terrorist organizations, and I think the thing that just jumped out at me at the time was that there is a political calculation. And at the time in 97, as well-intentioned as it may have been, and in retrospect, as fruitless it has been, but at the time in 97, the thought was as a gesture of goodwill, obviously other considerations, we will put this organization on the foreign terrorist organization list. First of all, it's easy to say in retrospect, it's difficult to extend goodwill from people who don't understand what goodwill is. But I would remind the Secretary, since 97 through today, as we speak, there has been absolutely no progress, no change in attitude, or more importantly, no change in conduct, no change in rhetoric from one set of mullahs to another. No change. And if the goal was to effect change because of a goodwill gesture, it has proven to be futile. I think it would also be important to remind the Secretary, as others have done here, that the #1 terrorist nation on the globe, 190 plus countries, the #1 terrorist state in the entire world is Iran. And others have mentioned Hamas, Hezbollah, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Make no mistake about it, as others have mentioned, Iran is directly responsible and continues to be directly responsible for the death of servicemen and women of the United States of America in Iraq and Afghanistan. And even today, they are subjected to the arms and munitions and the training provided by the Iranian government. So much for goodwill. And also, let's talk about how these negotiations have gone over the past several years with regard to a non-nuclear or the peaceful use of nuclear arms. The last couple of occasions they've met, and at the very outset of the negotiations and discussions, the Iranian representatives took that part of the discussion off the table. They only agreed the last couple of times they agreed to meet another time. Obviously, those discussions have borne no fruit whatsoever as well. I'd have to remind the Secretary what happened in 2009, shortly after the Status of Forces Agreement was changed, and these men and women entrusting us, surrendering their arms to defend themselves to us, were reassured, and we were reassured by the Iraqi government that they would be secure, they would be protected, and shortly thereafter was the first incursion, several dozen deaths, several hundred wounded. Our credibility is at issue, ladies and gentlemen. Not only our credibility in Camp Ashraf, but it seems to me our credibility is at issue around the world when we make a promise and don't keep it. I'd want my Secretary of State under any administration to consider that very important fact. And then in the post-2009 world, we see that European Parliament members, members of Congress, human rights organizations, lawyers, others are able to visit the camp. Suddenly, all those visits are cut off, and not only are those visits cut off, but after the latest incursion, we can't even get medical personnel in to see them, Madam Secretary. In 2010, the EU and the UK pull together very distinguished panelists, review all the evidence, all the testimony, everything they can find, and conclude as a matter of fact and as a matter of law, this is a group that should not be considered a foreign terrorist organization. They are a legitimate political opposition group committed to Democrat reform. Off the list. We all know what happened when the matter was brought before the Circuit Court here in Washington, D.C. Now, 7-8 months later, we're still waiting for a decision that obviously involves multiple agencies, but includes most primarily the State Department, perhaps the Defense Department as well. One would wonder how the Defense Department could be opposed to it, given the fact that the Iranians are supporting various militias and other terrorists and soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan to kill American troops at the present time, but still focusing on the Department of State. Let's talk about Libya for a moment. No-fly zone. Understanding other countries are going to send in military advisors to support a rebel force, an armed rebel force about whom we know nothing, under the guise of humanitarian support. if nothing else, if not America's credibility, if it's not keeping a promise, if nothing else, the protection and support and security of the men and women of Ashcroft is certainly a humanitarian cause that the entire world ought to be supporting. We've been focused on al-Qaeda. We now focus on